The engine hummed beneath the floorboards, a low, constant vibration that traveled up through the soles of my boots and settled deep in my bones. It was 3 a.m. The world outside the tinted windows was nothing but a blur of rain streaking against the glass, dissolving the highway into gray static. Inside, the air was heavy, pressurized with the scent of wet leather and the lingering, electric trace of her perfume, jasmine and something sharper, like ozone. I stood guard in the narrow corridor, my back pressed against the wood paneling, listening to the rhythm of her breathing just inches away. One step. That was the margin between my career and total catastrophe. Between being her shield and becoming the very danger I was sworn to stop. They call the job lead protection, but really, I'm an architect of silence. My life is defined by precision, by the grids I impose on chaos. I scan crowds for the one pair of eyes that isn't looking at the stage. I map exits in rooms I've never entered. I am the invisible wall that flashbulbs bounce off of, the dead space between the screaming fans and the asset. For 10 years, I've lived in that negative space. I don't have needs, I have protocols. I don't have impulses, I have threat assessments. But with Sloane, the wall felt like it was made of glass, transparent and terrifyingly fragile. She wasn't just a client, a line item on a manifest. She was a force of nature who demanded attention even when she was perfectly still. On stage, she was a god, commanding 20,000 people to weep with a flick of her wrist. But here, in the dim amber light of the back lounge, she was something more dangerous. She was real. She was the silence that followed the thunder, heavy and expectant. We were 3 months into the tour, a phrase that sounds clinical but felt like a war of attrition. The cities had dissolved into a smear of concrete arenas and hotel lobbies. My internal clock was shattered. The adrenaline didn't spike anymore. It just hummed, a toxic background radiation that kept us both awake. And this bus, this luxury Prevost coach, was supposed to be a sanctuary. But really, it was a gilded cage where privacy was a polite fiction and every sound was amplified. The rustle of sheets, the click of a lock, the soft exhale of a sigh. In this confined tube, the professional distance I relied on, that sacred 3-foot buffer zone, shrank to nothing. I could feel her presence like a change in air pressure. We had left Denver an hour ago, the sprawling city lights fading into the rearview mirror like dying embers. Now, the engine strained, a deeper growl as we began the long, dark climb up the Continental Divide. The highway turned treacherous, winding through the black peaks where the air grew thin and the isolation became absolute. The signal on my phone died, the little bars vanishing one by one, cutting the tether to the outside world. It was just us now, suspended in the dark, climbing toward the snow line, locked together in a space too small for the size of the feelings expanding between us. The darkness outside pressed in, pushing us closer. The road was slick, the curves sharp, and every sway of the bus threw our gravity off center, pulling me toward the one place I knew I couldn't go. The door to the back lounge didn't just open, it was breached. The shift in atmospheric pressure was immediate, a sudden drop in the room's sterile vacuum as Sloane stepped through the threshold. She was still vibrating, caught in the post-show danger zone, where adrenaline is a toxic chemical that hasn't cleared the bloodstream yet. She stood there, bracing herself against the doorframe as the bus lurched over a pothole, and for a second, the professional distance I'd carefully constructed felt utterly insufficient. She looked wrecked, hair a tangled halo, stage makeup smudged with a streak of silver glitter caught high on her cheekbone. She wasn't the polished commodity on the album cover. She was raw, panting slightly, the hem of her silk robe caught on the combat boots she hadn't bothered to take off yet. The contrast, delicate fabric against scuffed leather, made my mouth go dry. I snapped to attention. It was a reflex, a muscle memory honed by years of standing in shadows. My spine straightened, my hands clasping behind my back, eyes locking onto a neutral point on the wall above her head. "Clear back here?" she asked. Her voice was a ruin, raspy and dropped an octave lower than her singing range, stripped of all its public polish. "Secure," I replied. My voice was a flat line. A lie. Nothing about this was secure. She didn't go to her bunk. She didn't collapse into the oversized leather seating. She walked toward me. The kitchenette was behind where I stood, a narrow galley that required a delicate dance to navigate if two people were occupying the space. Protocol dictated I step aside, press myself into the alcove to grant her a wide berth. I started to move, my boot sliding back to open the lane. "Stay," she murmured. I froze. The command wasn't shouted. It was barely a whisper, but it held more weight than the microphone stand she threw around on stage. She stepped into the gap. The space between us evaporated. She wasn't moving for the water. She was moving for the proximity. She stopped mere inches from my chest, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off her body. It was an aggressive, feverish warmth, smelling of adrenaline and the sharp metallic tang of the stage. She reached past me for a glass. Her arm brushed against the tactical nylon of my jacket. The friction was a deafening sound in the quiet bus. She moved with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, her movements languid and heavy. She filled the glass, the sound of water pouring the only noise in the universe, and then she turned. She stayed inside my guard, looking up. Her eyes were dark, blown wide, the pupils swallowing the iris. There was a challenge there, a dangerous, playful glint that said she knew exactly how fast my heart was hammering against the ribs she was almost touching. The bus swayed heavily as we navigated a sharp switchback, the chassis groaning under the strain of the climb. Gravity shifted, throwing her weight against me for a fraction of a second. It was an accident of physics, but she didn't correct it immediately. She let herself linger, her shoulder pressing into my chest, a solid, undeniable weight. "You're too loud, you know," she whispered, the rim of the glass hovering near her lips. I blinked, confused, fighting the urge to steady her with my hands. "I haven't spoken, ma'am." She laughed, a low, dark sound that vibrated against my sternum. "Not your voice. Your head. You're thinking so loud it's drowning out the engine. You're wondering if I'm going to push you. I'm wondering if you need medical attention for dehydration," I countered, the words stiff and formal. "Liar," she breathed. She pulled back, but only an inch. The space she left was colder than the storm outside. She set the glass down on the counter behind me, her arm boxing me in for one terrifying heartbeat. "I don't need water, and I don't need a guard dog right now. I need to know that someone else in this metal box is actually alive." She leaned in, her breath ghosting over my jawline. "Stop scanning the exits. There's nowhere to go." The road changed first. The rhythmic hum of the tires on wet pavement shifted to a muffled, crunching silence as the rain hardened into sleet, and then, inevitably, into heavy, driving snow. We were ascending. The engine's growl deepened, a mechanical struggle against the gradient of the Rockies. Outside, the world had been erased. There were no more city lights, no passing trucks, no guardrails visible through the swirling white vortex that caught in the high beams. We were climbing into a void, a place where the air thinned and the laws of the lowlands ceased to apply. The signal on my phone had died miles ago, the little bars vanishing one by one until the screen was a useless black mirror. The Continental Divide wasn't just a geographical line. It felt like an airlock. We were leaving the atmosphere of the known world and entering a space where the oxygen was scarce and the stakes were lethal. Inside the coach, the isolation was absolute. The forward bunks were a tomb. The band, the tour manager, the crew, they were all unconscious, claiming the sleep of the dead after 3 back-to-back shows. The heavy partition door that separated the back lounge from the bunk alley was slid shut, latching with a finality that severed us from the rest of humanity. It was just the two of us, suspended in a luxury capsule fighting its way up a mountain. The silence should have been peaceful, but it was thick, charged with the static of everything we weren't saying. I could hear the wind buffeting the sides of the bus, a physical weight pushing against the metal skin, trying to shove us off the ledge. Sloane refused to settle. The water glass sat untouched on the counter. She moved through the small space with the restless energy of a panther pacing a cage that had suddenly become too small. She picked up a book, read the same sentence 3 times, and snapped it shut. She adjusted the thermostat, her fingers lingering on the dial, then let her hand drop. She wasn't shedding the adrenaline. She was marinating in it. Every time she turned, her gaze swept over me, heavy and tactile, checking if my walls were still up. I stood by the emergency exit, my standard post, trying to keep my breathing shallow, trying to regulate a heart rate that had nothing to do with the altitude. She didn't sit in her usual spot, the sprawling velvet banquette at the rear. She sat on the jump seat, directly across from me, her knees nearly brushing the fabric of my tactical pants. It was a deliberate invasion. She pulled her legs up, wrapping her arms around them, resting her chin on her knees, and just watched me. It wasn't the gaze of a star looking at an employee. It was the look of a woman dissecting a puzzle. "The air is thinner up here," she said softly, her voice barely cutting through the wind noise. "Does it make you dizzy? Or are you too trained for that too?" "I'm acclimated," I lied. I was dizzy, but it wasn't the elevation. It was the way the amber light caught the hollow of her throat. Then the universe called my bluff. The steady vibration of the engine faltered. It wasn't a catastrophic bang, but a sudden, sickening loss of torque. The lights flickered, once, twice, plunging us into total darkness before the emergency LEDs kicked in with a harsh blue glow. The forward momentum died. The bus shuddered, a heavy metal beast losing its footing, and rolled to a stop. The heater hummed and cut out. The sudden silence that rushed in wasn't empty. It was heavy, cold, and absolute. We were dead in the water, miles above the world, trapped in the dark with nothing but the heat of our own bodies. The driver managed to wrestle the dying beast into a desolate turnout, a gravel patch illuminated by a single, flickering halogen lamp that buzzed like a dying insect against the encroaching dark. The snow was coming down in sheets now, heavy and wet, erasing the road we'd just traveled and sealing us into the mountain's indifference. The silence returned, heavier this time, punctuated only by the driver cursing softly as he went to check the engine bay. Sloane didn't ask permission. She hit the door release. The pneumatic hiss sounded like a sharp gasp in the quiet. "I can't breathe in there," she said, stepping out into the freezing slush. I was on her heels instantly, the cold air hitting my face like a slap, sharpening senses that had been dulled by the warm amber lethargy of the lounge. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking up at the void where the sky should be, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. "It's quiet," she whispered, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Finally. Then the quiet shattered. Tires crunched on gravel, fast, aggressive. Twin beams of high-intensity light blinded us, cutting through the snow like lasers. A dark sedan skidded into the turnout, blocking our exit. It had been tracking us, a shadow in the storm, waiting for a moment of weakness. The door flew open before the car even settled. A figure scrambled out, manic, disheveled, shouting her name. It wasn't a fan. It was the hunger I saw in the eyes of the ones who thought they owned her, the ones who believed a ticket purchased a piece of her soul. He lunged, a black object in his hand. Camera? Weapon? In the strobe-light confusion of the snow, it didn't matter. The switch flipped. Instinct took over. I detonated. I grabbed Sloane by the lapels of her coat and slammed her back against the metal skin of the bus. My body became the wall. I spun, placing myself between her and the threat. I stepped into his space, intercepting his momentum with a calculated check to the chest that stopped him dead. He wheezed, the camera clattering to the ice. "Back," I snarled. It wasn't a request. It was a subsonic frequency of pure violence. He scrambled, slipping on the ice, realizing suddenly that the woman he wanted was behind a predator he hadn't accounted for. He retreated to his car, tires spinning as he fled back into the dark. I didn't watch him go. I turned back to her. I still had her pinned against the bus, my forearm braced against the metal above her shoulder, caging her in. My other hand was flat against her stomach, pressing her into the chassis, shielding her vital organs. We were breathing the same white clouds of vapor, chest to chest, the adrenaline surging between us like a live wire. I should have stepped back. The threat was gone. Training screamed at me to clear the space, scan the perimeter, secure the asset. But I didn't move. I couldn't. My hand on her stomach felt the rapid, fluttery beat of her heart through the silk and the cold. Her eyes were wide, looking up at me, but the fear was gone. It had been replaced by something darker, something that looked terrifyingly like awe. She wasn't looking at the exit. She was looking at the violence in my eyes, at the capability that I usually kept hidden under a suit jacket. "You stopped," she whispered, her voice trembling, not from cold, but from the shock of seeing the monster I kept on a leash. You actually stopped. I stopped him, I corrected, my voice rough, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against the sensitive skin of her wrist where my hand had slid. No, she breathed, leaning into my hand, closing the last fraction of distance until her body was flush against mine in the freezing wind. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes, dark and dilated. You stopped me. And she was right. For the first time, I wasn't just guarding a perimeter. I was holding her. The cold was biting at my exposed skin, but where we touched, I was burning. And God help me, I didn't want to let go. The pneumatic hiss of the bus door sealing shut behind us sounded like a decompression chamber. The world outside, the biting wind, the blinding snow, the man with a camera who wanted to consume her, was severed. We were back in the capsule, but the atmosphere had mutated. It wasn't just the silence of the climb anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of the aftermath. The driver was still outside, wrestling with the engine panel in the storm, leaving the interior suspended in a dim, battery-powered twilight. My hands were shaking. It wasn't fear. Fear is useful. Fear is sharp. It was the chemical crash of adrenaline leaving the bloodstream. The violence I had uncorked to stop that man was trying to shove itself back into the bottle, leaving my muscles twitching with unspent kinetic energy. I needed to de-escalate. I needed to return to the protocol. Secure the perimeter, assess the threat, reset the distance. But as I turned to look at Sloane, I realized the distance was gone. She was shivering, violent tremors that had nothing to do with the temperature. The snow on her coat was melting, dark droplets soaking into the expensive wool and dripping onto the floor. She looked small. The force of nature who commanded stadiums had vanished, leaving behind a woman standing in a dark hallway, staring at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Back, I said, the word coming out rougher than I intended. We need to get you back. I didn't wait for her to argue. I guided her down the narrow corridor toward the rear stateroom. The hallway on a tour bus is an exercise in forced intimacy, 18 inches wide, lined with bunks where the crew slept the sleep of the dead. We moved in tandem, a clumsy, friction-heavy dance. My hand hovered at the small of her back, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat of her body through the layers of damp clothing. Every sway of the stalled bus, buffeted by the wind, threw us together, her shoulder brushing my chest, my hip checking hers. The air in the corridor was thick, smelling of wet wool and the sudden, sharp scent of her fear. We reached the door to her private quarters, the sanctuary. In 3 months, I had never crossed this threshold while she was inside. I had swept it for bugs, checked the locks, and secured the windows, but always when it was empty. To enter while she was there was a violation of the unwritten contract between asset and protector. But she didn't stop at the door. She pushed it open and stumbled inside. And when I hesitated on the threshold, caught between duty and decency, she turned. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't stay out there." I stepped in. The room was a chaos of silken shadows. The bed was unmade, a tangle of sheets where she had tossed and turned during the long drive. Books were stacked on the floor. A half-written set list was taped to the mirror. It was aggressively human. It stripped away the last layer of the Sloane persona. She let her wet coat slide off her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor in a heap. She didn't pick it up. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the mattress so hard her knuckles turned white. The teasing glint that had been in her eyes an hour ago was extinguished. She wasn't trying to provoke me now. She was trying to hold herself together. "He was so close," she murmured, her voice hollow. "I didn't even hear him. I was just looking at the snow, and then he was there." She looked up at me, her eyes raw and unguarded. I thought I was used to it, the noise, the grabbing, but out there, in the dark, it felt personal. "It is personal," I said quietly. "That's why I'm here." I turned to leave, to take up my post outside the door where I belonged. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking slightly as I gripped the cold metal. No, the word was a hook in my spine. I stopped. "Madison," she said, using my name for the first time in weeks. It sounded foreign, heavy with a new kind of authority. "I don't need a guard dog right now. I have plenty of those. I need..." She trailed off, her breath hitching. She looked at me, really looked at me, stripping away the tactical vest and the earpiece and the badge. I need you to stop being the wall, just for a minute. Please. I looked at the door. It was the only barrier left. If I stayed, I wasn't guarding the asset. I was comforting the woman. It was a breach of every protocol in the manual. It was the end of the job. I let go of the handle. I'm here, I said. And the room seemed to shrink, sealing us in. The emergency battery finally died, and the harsh blue glare of the LEDs faded, plunging the room into a softer, more dangerous darkness. The only light now came from the rhythmic, amber pulse of the hazard lights outside, flashing against the heavy velvet curtains like a slow, dying heartbeat. It washed the room in intervals of gold and shadow, revealing her face for a second before burying it in the dark again. The storm outside had become a distant, muffled roar, creating a cocoon of silence that felt pressurized, as if the air inside the cabin was denser than the thin atmosphere of the mountain. We were suspended in the void, cut off from the tour, the schedule, and the world that demanded so much of her. The room smelled of her, a scent that bypassed my logic and settled deep in my chest. Sloane shifted on the bed, the silk of her robe whispering against the duvet. She didn't look at me. She studied her hands, tracing the lines of her palm as if reading a map to a place she couldn't find. "Do you know what the loudest sound in the world is?" she asked, her voice low, vibrating through the small space. "It's not the amplifiers. It's the silence when the door closes. That sudden, violent quiet where I realize everyone screaming my name doesn't actually know me. They just know the idea. They want the light, Madison. They want to stand in the glow. But they don't want the woman who has to burn to make it." I stood by the dresser, my hands still trembling slightly. I wanted to give her the standard answer, the one about security protocols and perimeter checks. But the script didn't fit anymore. "They love you," I said, but the words felt hollow. "No," she corrected, looking up as the amber light washed over us again. "They consume me. They're cannibals. They take little pieces, a photo, a signature, a smile. They carve it off and take it home. And every night, I feel a little lighter, a little less real. Like eventually, there won't be anything left but the costume." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine in the gloom. "Except with you." The air in the room thickened. My chest tightened, the Kevlar vest suddenly feeling like a corset made of iron. "I'm just doing my job, Sloane." "Are you?" she challenged, leaning forward. "My manager protects the investment. The label protects the revenue stream. But you, out there in the snow, you didn't care about the asset. You were protecting me. You're the only person in my life who stands between the world and the woman, not the star. You're the only one who keeps me whole. You're the only one who doesn't want to take something from me." My internal wall, that carefully constructed discipline, began to fracture. I had spent 10 years convincing myself that I was a machine, a tool to be deployed. But as she spoke, I realized the terrifying truth I had been suppressing since Denver. I wasn't guarding her because it was the assignment. I was guarding her because the thought of anyone else touching her, hurting her, or taking even a single piece of her made me want to burn the world down. "I can't let them have you," I whispered. The admission was involuntary, a betrayal of my discipline. "Then don't," she breathed. "Don't let them in. And don't you leave." She wasn't talking about the door anymore. She was looking at me with a terrifying clarity, seeing past the badge, past the stoic expression I wore like armor. She saw the hunger I thought I had buried. The subtext was a physical weight in the room. She was speaking about safety, about protection, about the need for a shield. But the tone was pure, unadulterated need. She was asking me to be the wall, yes, but she was also asking to be held behind it. For the first time in my career, the lead bodyguard wasn't observing the subject. I was being seen. And the way she looked at me, with that mix of fear and absolute trust, made me realize that the most dangerous thing on this mountain wasn't the storm. It was the fact that I wanted to cross the 3 feet of floorboards between us and never walk back. She was still shaking. The tremors were small, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the mattress and into the floorboards where I stood. It was the shock, a biological feedback loop I had seen 100 times. Standard procedure requires a specific response: maintain visual contact, offer water, radio for a medic if necessary. But the radio was dead, and the water was in the other room. There was only the dark, the amber pulse of the hazard lights, and the woman unraveling in front of me. I took a step forward. It wasn't a tactical decision. It was a gravitational one. I reached out, my hand hovering for a fraction of a second, the last moment of my career as I knew it, before settling on her shoulder. It was meant to be a brace, a steadying weight to ground her against the panic. "Breathe," I instructed, my voice cracking on the single syllable. Her skin was burning. Through the thin silk of her robe, the heat of her body seared into my palm, a stark contrast to the freezing cold that still clung to my tactical gloves. I should have pulled away. The contact had served its purpose. But I didn't move. My thumb, betraying 10 years of discipline, brushed against the hollow of her collarbone. It wasn't a check for injury. It was a question. It was a terrifyingly gentle exploration of the tension radiating off her. The texture of her skin was soft, impossibly soft, against the roughness of my hand. And that contrast, the protector and the protected, the leather and the silk, short-circuited the logic centers of my brain. The professional distance didn't just erode, it evaporated. Sloane went still. The trembling stopped instantly, replaced by a rigid electric awareness. She leaned in, pressing her shoulder up into my hand, capturing my touch, increasing the pressure until it felt like an anchor. She turned her head, her cheek brushing against my knuckles, her eyes locking onto mine in the gloom. The amber light flashed, illuminating the challenge written in the set of her jaw. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the siren. "Is this protocol?" she whispered, the words vibrating against my skin. "Is this how you secure the asset, Madison?" It was a dare. She was asking me to lie, or to break. The correct answer was no. The correct answer was to retreat, to apologize, to step back into the hallway and file a resignation letter in the morning. I knew the consequences. I knew that crossing this line meant I could never go back. But the smell of her, that maddening mix of rain and expensive perfume, filled my lungs, drowning out the rational voice in my head. I looked at her, really looked at her, not as a target to be shielded, but as a woman who was terrified and terrifyingly beautiful in the dark. The line between duty and desire, which I had walked like a tightrope for 3 months, didn't just blur, it snapped. The lead bodyguard didn't exist in this room. There was only the sudden, violent realization that I would rather be fired than take my hand off her skin. To hell with the protocol, I breathed. I moved. I didn't step back. I stepped in. My hand slid from her shoulder to the side of her neck, my fingers threading into the damp, tangled darkness of her hair. It was a claim. It was a possession. I wasn't the observer anymore. I was the storm she had invited in. I felt her pulse hammering against my fingertips, a frantic, rabbit-fast rhythm that matched my own. She gasped, a sharp intake of air that sounded loud in the quiet room, her head tilting back, exposing the line of her throat, a gesture of absolute surrender. The bus swayed gently in the wind, rocking us, but I was rock steady. I wasn't guarding her from the world anymore. I was closing it out, narrowing the universe down to the friction of my thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The protector became the pursuer, the professional distance evaporating into the heat rising between us. The distance closed with the terrifying inevitability of a glacier calving. When her mouth finally met mine, it wasn't tentative. There was no hesitation, no polite testing of the waters. It was the collapse of a structure that had been groaning under its own weight for months. The impact was solid, a sudden realignment of my entire universe. I felt the precise weight of her intention, the desperate, clawing need that matched the roar in my own blood. For 10 years, I had trained myself to be stone, to be the surface that things deflected off of. But she didn't deflect. She shattered right through the center. It was heavy with the weeks of silence, the unsaid words, the glances in rearview mirrors, the agonizing proximity of the stage wings. It was a kiss that tasted of the miles we had traveled and the lines we were erasing. Her hands, usually so delicate on the piano keys, gripped the lapels of my tactical jacket with a strength that surprised me. She pulled me down, anchoring me into the kiss, demanding that I meet her in the wreckage of our professional boundaries. I tasted the lingering adrenaline on her tongue, the metallic tang of the fear that had almost consumed her outside, and beneath it all, the faint, sweet ghost of the wine she'd been drinking before the world stopped. It was intoxicating, a sensory overload that drowned out the wind howling against the glass. The air in the room seemed to ignite, burning away the oxygen, leaving us gasping into each other's mouths, trading breath like it was the only resource left on the mountain. My hands, rough from years of handling weapons and restraints, felt foreign against the slide of her silk robe. I was terrified I would bruise her, that my touch was too coarse for something so refined. But she didn't want gentle. She arched into the friction, a low sound vibrating in her throat that I felt against my own lips. The bus groaned under the assault of a fresh gust of wind, rocking on its suspension, and the sensation was dizzying, like we were suspended in free fall, untethered from the earth, spinning in a dark void where the only gravity was the heat of her skin against mine. The physical world, the snow, the engine, the road, dissolved, leaving only this frantic, desperate connection. I couldn't tell where the storm ended and we began. We stumbled, tangled together, not breaking the contact, moving blindly toward the narrow bunk. The space was impossibly small, a recess in the wall meant for sleep, not for this unraveling. But we fit. We collapsed into the tangle of sheets, the darkness of the alcove swallowing us whole. The transition from vertical to horizontal felt like a surrender. The armor I wore, the vest, the boots, the badge, felt heavy and absurd in this intimate geometry. Yet I didn't take them off. They were the last remnants of the person I was supposed to be, now pressed uselessly against the woman I was sworn to protect. The confinement wasn't a cage anymore. It was a cocoon, shielding us from the consequences waiting outside the door. Lying there, her body pressed along the length of mine, the reality of what we had done settled over me. This was the ultimate breach. The contract was shredded. I had just set a match to my career, effectively ending my life as a professional. I should have been terrified. I should have been calculating the fallout, the termination meeting, the loss of clearance. But as her head settled into the crook of my shoulder, her breathing slowing to match the rhythm of my own, all I could feel was a profound, terrifying sense of rightness. The danger was there, sharp and cold like the air outside, but it was irrelevant. Her hand found mine in the dark, her fingers lacing through my gloved ones, holding on tight. The storm raged against the metal skin of the bus, a chaotic fury trying to get in. But in the narrow bunk, in the heat of our shared breath, there was a stillness that felt like salvation. We didn't speak. There were no words left that wouldn't sound like lies. We just lay there, suspended out of time, two women who had stopped running long enough to collide. And as the exhaustion finally pulled us under, dragging us into a sleep that was heavy and dreamless, I realized I wasn't guarding the door anymore. I was on the other side of it. The light wasn't gentle. It was an interrogation. It sliced through the curtains, a blinding white that bounced off the snow and seared its way into the dark recess of the bunk. It demanded an accounting of the night. The bus was moving again. The vibration beneath the mattress had shifted from the desperate, straining growl of the climb to a steady, rhythmic hum. We were descending. The crisis of the storm had passed, the mechanical failure resolved by the driver in the gray hours of dawn, leaving behind a sky of aggressive blue. We were rolling down from the sanctuary of the clouds, back toward the gravity of the real world. I woke up with her weight heavy on my chest, her arm thrown across my tactical vest like a claim. For a moment, suspended between sleep and duty, the boundaries were still dissolved. I was just a body, warm and anchored, holding the only thing that mattered. Then the radio on my belt crackled, a ghost of a signal returning as we dropped in elevation, and the illusion shattered. The power indicator blinked in the gloom, a rhythmic warning. I wasn't just a body. I was the lead protection officer, and I was currently compromising the asset in the most fundamental way possible. Extricating myself was a surgical operation, a physical untangling that felt like tearing stitches. I moved by inches, sliding out from under her warmth, replacing my body with a pillow. She stirred, making a soft sound of protest, a murmur that sounded terrifyingly like my name. But she didn't wake. I stood up in the narrow corridor, and the cold air hit me like a judgment. My uniform was wrinkled, the sharp lines of my jacket crushed by the pressure of her embrace. I smoothed the fabric, checking my reflection in the darkened glass of the microwave. I looked the same. The badge was straight, but the eyes staring back were strangers. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the other side of the wall and realized it was made of paper. I made coffee. The ritual was grounding, black, bitter, hot. It was a task I could perform with mechanical precision. When Sloane emerged 20 minutes later, the dynamic in the room shifted tectonically. She didn't look wrecked anymore. The sleep had restored her. She stood in the doorway of the bunk alley, wrapped in that same silk robe, looking at me. There should have been regret. The morning light is usually cruel to secrets. It exposes the cracks, the mistakes, the lapses in judgment. But as she walked past me to get a mug, brushing my arm with a deliberate, casual intimacy, there was no apology in her posture. The silence wasn't heavy with shame. It was vibrating with a new, terrifying frequency. It was the silence of conspirators. I resumed my post by the door, the standard stance, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped, eyes scanning. But my scan was compromised. I watched her lean against the counter, blowing steam off her coffee, and I realized I couldn't see the client anymore. I saw the pulse in her neck I had tasted. I saw the tension in her shoulders I had soothed. I possessed a secret map of the territory I was guarding, a cartography of scars that wasn't in any file. The landscape had changed. I wasn't just protecting a body. I was hoarding a memory. She caught me watching. She didn't reprimand me for the breach of protocol. She took a sip, her eyes holding mine over the rim of the mug, and the corner of her mouth quirked up. It wasn't her stage smile, that blinding, practiced thing she gave the cameras. It was small, private, and devastatingly knowing. It acknowledged the invisible thread pulled taut between us. The bus rounded a curve, the city skyline appearing in the distance. Civilization, schedules, the noise. But in that quiet kitchen, suspended between the mountain and the madness, the smile said, "I know who you are now, and you can never go back to just watching." The descent was a slow, controlled fall back into gravity. The pristine, unforgiving light of the divide gave way to the bruised purple of the foothills, and then, inevitably, to the gray, industrial sprawl of the interstate. We watched the world reassemble itself through the windshield. Billboards, traffic jams, the ugly, functional architecture of civilization. With every mile marker we passed, the protective bubble of the bus thinned. The phone started pinging, a sudden cacophony of digital demands that had been silenced by the storm. The tour manager woke up, shouting instantly into a headset about sound checks and press junkets. The driver radioed the venue logistics team. The noise returned, aggressive and relentless, trying to drown out the memory of the quiet breathing in the bunk. We didn't discuss the terms. There was no negotiation, no "what are we" conversation whispered over cold coffee while the world rushed by. The contract was signed in the silence. It was sealed in the way she moved around me in the narrow kitchenette, not avoiding my space, but inhabiting it, a gravitational orbit that only we could feel. We rebuilt the walls, brick by brick, because we had to. I put the tactical vest back on, tightening the Velcro straps until they dug into my ribs, a physical reminder of the containment I needed to survive the day. She put on her sunglasses, the oversized frames hiding the eyes that had looked at me with such naked, terrifying want. We were putting on our costumes for the performance of Star and Bodyguard, but under the layers, the skin was still burning. The arrival at the venue was a tactical nightmare. A subterranean loading dock smelling of diesel fumes, damp concrete, and old garbage. The transition was violent. 1 minute we were in the sanctuary, the next, the pneumatic door hissed open and the chaos rushed in. Security teams, local police, stagehands. It was a riot of motion. I stepped out first, the habit of protection overriding the tremor in my hands. I scanned the catwalks, the shadows, the exits. But the threat assessment was fundamentally different now. Before, a threat was a professional failure, a mark on a record. Now, it was a personal apocalypse. I wasn't just scanning for danger to an asset. I was looking for anything that dared to touch what was mine. She paused at the bottom of the metal stairs, surrounded by a phalanx of handlers and publicists. She didn't look back. That would be amateur, a crack in the armor. Instead, she looked at the reflection in the blacked-out window of the bus. Our eyes met in the dark glass. It was a micro moment, invisible to the cameras and the crew buzzing around us. A tightening of the jaw, a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was the ratification of our secret treaty. You keep them away, the look said, and I'll keep you close. I adjusted my earpiece, the coil cold against my neck. Asset is moving, I said into the mic, my voice steady, flat, professional. The lie tasted like ash on my tongue. We walked the gauntlet to the dressing room. I walked 3 paces behind and 1 to the left, the standard formation. The crowd noise bled through the arena walls, a dull, hungry roar that vibrated in the floor. She walked with her head high, the Sloane persona fully engaged, radiant and untouchable. But I knew the truth. I knew the texture of the fear she hid under the sequins. I knew the warmth of the woman shivering in the dark. And as I took my post outside her door, standing guard in the fluorescent hum of the hallway, I realized the terrifying geometry of our new reality. The professional distance was a fiction. We were connected by an invisible, unbreakable thread, pulled taut across the noise of the world. The danger is infinitely greater now, because the loss would be total. Every flashbulb looks like a muzzle flare. Every scream sounds like a warning. But when the show ends and the lights die, the silence waits for us. I can still smell the rain and jasmine on my jacket, a lingering ghost of the mountain. If you want to see where the road leads next, subscribe. The tour is long, and the nights are just getting started.